On a warm afternoon glowing with quiet sunlight, even Hartley stepped into a bustling bakery with his young son, Liam, both exhausted, hungry, and out of options. He wasn't there to buy anything, only to ask if they had leftover bread or expired pastries that others no longer wanted. As he gathered his courage to speak, a woman in the corner, Celeste Ainsworth, a billionaire wrapped in loneliness, listened closely. And in that fragile moment, 3 lives quietly shifted toward an unexpected act of grace. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden haze across the city as even Hartley led his young son, Liam, down the busy sidewalk. People moved around them with brisk confidence, students clutching notebooks, office workers checking their watches, tourists laughing as they took photos of shop windows, but even walked with a heaviness that seemed to slow the world around him. His clothes hung loosely on his frame after weeks of skipped meals, and his unshaven face showed the traces of a man who had been fighting battles no one else could see. Liam held his father's hand with trust, but even a child's hope could be worn thin when hunger followed them like a shadow. The boys' steps were shorter, lighter, but each one carried a faint stiffness, the kind that came from going too long without proper food. They stopped in front of the bakery, a charming place with polished windows, bright signage, and the smell of fresh bread drifting through the door each time a customer entered or left. The place looked almost unreal to Even, like a fragment of a better world he no longer belonged to. Inside, warm lights illuminated rows of pastries arranged like treacherous golden croissants, fruit tarts glistening with syrup, and cakes dusted with sugar. It was a scene that would make most people feel comfort, but for Even, it stirred a mix of longing and shame. He had passed by this bakery dozens of times, each time imagining that one day he might bring Liam here for a treat they could actually afford. Today, however, he wasn't stepping inside for desserts or snacks. He was stepping inside because there was nothing left at home, nothing to offer his son except the hope that maybe, just maybe, there would be something people were willing to give away. Even hesitated at the door, squeezing Liam's hand. "Stay close to me, okay?" he murmured. His voice was gentle but strained, like he was speaking through a tightness in his chest. Liam simply nodded, his brown eyes flicking up toward his father with a mixture of curiosity and concern no child should have to feel. He didn't ask questions. He had learned young that sometimes adults didn't have answers. When they stepped into the bakery, the warmth inside wrapped around them in a way that made Even's stomach clench painfully from hunger. The scent of butter and sugar floated through the air, enough to make Liam inhale sharply as if trying to savor the smell itself. Even felt the boy's hand tighten around his own. The interior was bright and lively, customers chatting, a barista steaming milk behind the counter, workers sliding trays of pastries into display cases. Even became painfully aware of his worn shoes on the spotless tiles, the frayed sleeve of his jacket, and the way a few customers briefly glanced at him before returning to their conversations. He tried not to care. He reminded himself why he had come. He needed to ask. He needed to push past the embarrassment, because his son needed food more than he needed pride. Liam stared at the pastries behind the glass case with wide, fascinated eyes. There was a strawberry tart with glossy red slices arranged like petals, a chocolate cake layered with dark ganache, little custard cups with caramel tops that gleamed like amber. Liam's gaze lingered the longest on a simple, round sponge cake dusted with powdered sugar. He didn't ask for it, he never asked for anything, but even saw that tiny flicker of longing cross his face. It hurt more than hunger did. Even approached the counter slowly, aware that his voice might shake when he spoke. The young woman behind the register greeted him with a polite smile, but her expression shifted slightly when she noticed his appearance. "Not unkind, just uncertain. Can I help you, sir?" she asked. Even swallowed, his throat dry. I was wondering," he began, choosing his words carefully, "if you might have any leftover bread or pastries. Anything you were planning to throw out at the end of the day." He tried to keep his tone steady, but the weight behind the request pressed through every syllable. He wasn't a man used to asking for help. At another time in his life, he might have been the one doing the helping, but life had a way of flipping fortunes without warning. The cashier blinked, surprised. "Leftovers." She glanced over at a coworker, then at the manager near the espresso machine. Even saw the hesitation in her face. "We have rules about that," she said softly. "We don't give anything away before closing." Even nodded once, as though he'd expected that answer. Part of him had hoped for the small miracle of someone bending the rules, but he knew better than to ask for miracles. He opened his mouth to say thank you anyway, to tell Liam it was time to go, but the words stuck. Liam was still watching the pastries with quiet admiration, unaware of the refusal, unaware of the H forming behind his father's ribs. And that was when Celeste Ainsworth, sitting at a small corner table with a cup of tea and a stack of documents, noticed them. She had come here for a moment of peace after a long meeting. choosing this bakery because it reminded her faintly of afternoons she used to spend with her husband and daughter, days filled with gentle laughter before loss reshaped her entire world. Celeste looked up from her papers when she heard Ivan's trembling question. Her eyes followed the way Liam stood close to his father, curious but careful, and the way Ivan's shoulders dipped ever so slightly as he absorbed the cashier's hesitant refusal. Celeste observed the scene with a stillness sharpened by memory, by grief, by the ache of years spent trying to rebuild a heart that had cracked in too many places. She saw not strangers, but a reflection of something she had once known, love stretched thin by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Something inside her shifted, subtle yet undeniable. She didn't speak. She didn't stand up right away. She simply watched, letting understanding settle over her like a warm tide. Ivan finally manages to whistle, "All right, thank you anyway." But the words tasted hollow. He turned slightly toward Liam, ready to guide him back outside, back to uncertainty, back to another long night of making do with nothing. The bakery around them continued humming with life, but for Ivan, the world had narrowed to the small, heartbreaking moment of knowing he could not give his son even a simple piece of bread today. Yet as he took Liam's hand again, something unexpected began unfolding, something that would alter not just their evening, but the very course of 3 separate lives. Liam's small hand rested in his father's, and though he didn't tug or speak, his steps betrayed the exhaustion that had been building over days of eating too little. His father had always tried to shield him from hardship, to turn poverty into an adventure, to make thin meals feel like treasures. But children understood more than parents realized. Liam could sense the tension in the lines of Ivan's face, the way his father paused before entering each store, the way he scanned prices with a mix of hope and defeat, the way he tried to smile even when his stomach growled. Hunger was not new to either of them, but today it had settled into Liam's limbs with a heaviness that made him try harder to stand tall, as if he knew his father needed that tiny display of strength. As Ivan guided him deeper to the bakery, Liam's eyes wandered across the vibrant colors and textures behind the glass. He wasn't merely looking, he was absorbing everything with the particular wonder only a starving child can have when faced with abundance. Croissants layered in buttery folds looked to him like soft golden clouds. The custard tarts shimmered under the lights as though coated with tiny drops of captured sunrise. There was a chocolate muffin with chunks melting into its warm top, and Liam felt his throat tighten at the thought of biting into something so rich. But he didn't speak, he never begged for things he knew his father couldn't give. At most, he looked. And even when he looked, he did so gently, afraid that wanting too much might somehow make it harder for Ivan. He shifted his weight from foot to foot as he tried to keep up with the adults around him. The bakery's floor tiles were smooth, almost glossy, and each step created a faint sensation of sliding, which made him feel even smaller among the crowd. A woman beside him wore high heels that clicked with every step, a rhythm Liam found almost hypnotic. A college student carried a tray stacked with pastries, and Liam watched the crumbs fall like tiny blessings he wished he could gather. A businessman in a navy suit sipped his coffee, the warm steam rising toward his face. And Liam felt a pang of yearning, not even for food, just for comfort. Still, he pressed closer to his father, finding reassurance in the familiar shape of Ivan's coat. He tugged lightly at the sleeve, not enough to distract, only to let him know he was still there. Ivan glanced down and gave a small smile, thin but full of love. The smile didn't reach his eyes, but Liam cherished it anyway. It was a reminder that they were facing the world together. As Ivan spoke to the cashier, Liam noticed the shift in the adults' expressions. He didn't fully understand why their faces changed, why polite smiles wavered, why brows creased with uncertainty, why glances flicked from his father's jacket to his shoes to his tired eyes. But he sensed something was wrong. Children, even when they don't grasp the details, are experts in reading the room. Liam could tell the answer wouldn't be good long before the words were spoken. The cashier's voice softened in a way that made Liam's stomach twist. He watched as the woman hesitated, as another worker leaned in to whisper something, as the manager frowned while pretending not to listen. Liam didn't know the bakery's rules, didn't know anything about policies or liability or numbers on paper. But he understood rejection. He had seen it at grocery stores when his father counted coins and realized they weren't enough. He had seen it at job interviews when people shook their heads with practiced sympathy. He had seen it in the subtle way people avoided them in public spaces. Liam stood very still, observing the tension gathering around his father like an invisible storm. Ivan kept his voice steady, but Liam could hear the strain, how each word carried hope and dread intertwined. He felt the moment his father's heart dropped, even before Ivan's shoulders slumped just slightly, the almost imperceptible sign of a man trying to brace himself for disappointment. And then Liam did something he rarely allowed himself to do. He reached for one of the pastries with his eyes rather than his hands, lingering on a small chocolate swirled bun near the edge of the display. It wasn't the most elaborate dessert. It didn't sparkle like the fruit tarts or glow like the sugar-dusted cakes. But something about its warm, earthy color reminded him of better days when even had scraped together enough to buy a small treat after long bus rides or tiring errands. A single pastry shared between them used to feel like a feast. Now, even imagining it made his chest feel tight. He looked up at his father again, as if wondering whether daring to hope was too much. Even turned toward him with a soft expression that tried to hide heartbreak. It wasn't the answer Liam wanted, but he understood. So he nodded, lowering his gaze. He tried to pretend he wasn't disappointed, but a faint tremor passed through his lips. The bakery's brightness made his hunger more intense, not because of the light itself, but because every detail was so vivid. The smell of cinnamon drifted from the ovens, making his stomach clench. Someone opened a fresh box of pastries, releasing a burst of buttery aroma that nearly weakened his knees. The soft thump of a tray being set down made him think of loaves being removed from warm ovens. Everything around him emphasized what he didn't have, what he might not have for days. He shifted again, feeling a wave of dizziness. It wasn't enough to make him fall, but enough to remind him that he hadn't eaten anything meaningful since yesterday morning. Even sensed it immediately, steadying him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. Liam leaned into the touch, instinctively grateful for it. His father's hand was warm, one of the few warm things left in his world. Trying to distract himself, Liam focused on small details around him. The way the sugar on a donut caught the light. The way a barista decorated a cappuccino with a leaf pattern. The faint hum of the refrigerators. The soft rustle of a paper bag being folded. These sounds and sights filled the air with a kind of vitality he wished he could join. But he felt like a spectator standing behind a glass wall looking in on a life he couldn't reach. Then, as he shifted his gaze across the room, his eyes landed on a woman sitting alone at a corner table. Her posture was straight, elegant, almost regal. Papers were spread before her, but she wasn't reading them. She was watching. Not in a rude way, not with judgment, more like someone trying to understand a story unfolding in front of her. Liam didn't know who she was. Didn't know that her name was Celeste Ainsworth, or that her life was shaped by losses deeper than he could imagine. All he saw was a woman whose eyes softened when she looked at him and his father, as though she recognized something others ignored. For a moment, their gazes met. It was brief, but enough to make Liam feel noticed in a world that often treated him as invisible. He didn't smile, he was too tired, but his eyes lingered with a trace of curiosity. He didn't know it yet, but this single glance would begin a chain of events that would change everything for him and for the woman watching. Even stood at the counter trying to hold himself together, and though he managed to keep his voice steady, something inside him tightened painfully. Liam's presence at his side made every tremor of weakness feel magnified. He wanted to protect his son from the sting of rejection, but children sensed more than adults ever admitted. The cashier's uneasy glance, the manager's evaluating stare, the soft, apologetic tone, it was enough for Liam to understand that the answer wasn't good. Even swallowed hard, wishing he could turn the moment into something less humiliating, something less revealing of how desperate their situation truly was. The cashier kept shifting her weight, looking between Ivan and the pastries as if uncertain how to proceed. Her hesitance wasn't cruel. It was procedural, but procedures rarely made room for compassion. Ivan tried to thank her anyway, but the words barely formed before fading in his throat. He felt Liam leaning closer, looking up at him with concern that felt older than his years. Ivan rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, hoping to convey reassurance he no longer felt. That was the moment when Celeste Ainsworth's attention sharpened. She had been sitting in the far corner, her tea cooling in front of her, her documents resting untouched beside the saucer. At first, she had only glanced in their direction because she noticed a child staring at the pastries with a kind of restrained longing that tugged faintly at her heart. But as she listened to the exchange at the counter, she began paying closer attention to the wary posture of the father, the thinness of the child, and the way both tried to maintain dignity even as circumstances pushed them into vulnerability. Celeste had known profound loss that had hollowed out entire years of her life. Losing her husband and daughter in the same accident had not just broken her heart but fractured the world around her. Things that once felt bright became muted. Places that once brought comfort felt distant, even in rooms full of people. She often felt as if she were standing on the edge of a memory that no longer belonged to her. Work had become her refuge, money her shield, efficiency her language. Yet compassion, once the center of her identity, had become something she felt from a distance rather than practiced. But watching Even and Liam triggered an ache in her chest, an old, familiar ache she had almost forgotten how to feel. She saw the slight tremor in Ivan's left hand as he waited for the cashier's response. She saw the way his eyes briefly closed when the answer wasn't what he hoped for, as if he were gathering strength for the next step. She saw Liam's attempt to stand straighter, to display a small, brave demeanor meant to lighten his father's burden. And she saw something else too, a memory of her own daughter, who once tugged at her skirt inside a similar bakery, asking for a raspberry tart with a smile that lit up the entire shop. It wasn't simply pity that stirred in Celeste. Pity was too easy, too shallow for what she was experiencing. It was recognition of struggle, of love stretched thin, of desperation woven with courage. A father who had nothing but tried anyway. A child who wanted but didn't ask. These were the kinds of moments that life carved into people, leaving marks no one saw but everyone carried. Celeste leaned back slightly in her chair, observing the interactions around her with a focused intensity. She noticed how the manager avoided making eye contact with Even, perhaps afraid of confrontation or guilt. She saw the bakery's customers glance over briefly, then turn away, unwilling to involve themselves. She watched Liam's small shoulders rise and fall with a breath that seemed heavier than his frame could hold. The entire scene unfolded like a quiet tragedy disguised inside a brightly lit shop full of warmth and comfort. She thought of how different her life had once been. She had spent afternoons baking cookies with her daughter, laughing as they tried to add too many chocolate chips. She had visited bakeries to celebrate milestones, a report card, a lost baby tooth, a simple just because. She had once believed that love could hold back the worst things in the world. She had once believed that safety could be bought with care, but the universe had proven her wrong. And for years she had walked through life with a kind of emotional numbness that protected her from further pain. Yet today something pierced through that numbness. Maybe it was Ivan's trembling courage, maybe Liam's fragile steadiness, or maybe the haunting thought of what her daughter might have become if she had survived. Celeste felt an almost involuntary pull toward them, as though fate had pushed her into this bakery at the exact moment she was meant to witness the scene. Even attempted to turn away with Liam murmuring a soft reassurance to the boy, though his own heart felt like it was tearing at the seams. The thought of stepping back onto the street with nothing to offer his son besides more disappointment made his chest tighten. Liam looked up at him, eyes wide in that searching way children have when they want to understand everything, but don't want to burden the adult they love most. Celeste felt her fingers curl around the edge of her table as if anchoring herself. She had money more than she could ever spend. She had influence, power, and the resources to change someone's life in an instant. Yet rarely did she feel compelled to act outside of business or philanthropy designed for public visibility. But this wasn't about charity or press releases or generosity displayed for admiration. This was about humanity, raw and real, unfolding right before her eyes. She studied Even carefully. His coat was worn but clean, evidence of someone who cared despite difficulty. His hair was disheveled, not from neglect but from stress. His expression carried the weight of exhaustion mixed with relentless determination. Liam's face mirrored so much of his father's pain and yet managed to hold on to a spark of childlike wonder, proving that even hardship couldn't extinguish innocence completely. Celeste reached for her handbag, her movements deliberate, her mind already forming a plan. She wasn't acting out of impulse. Something deeper guided her, something that reminded her of who she used to be before loss altered her path. She wasn't thinking about consequences or appearances. She wasn't thinking about how strangers might perceive her involvement. She was thinking solely of the boy who hadn't eaten enough, the father who carried too much, and the possibility that she could shift the direction of their day, maybe even their lives. As Ivan and Liam prepared to leave the counter, Celeste rose from her chair. She knew this moment mattered. She didn't know them, and they didn't know her, but something invisible connected them, a thread woven from empathy, memory, and the quiet recognition of shared suffering. Her steps carried her forward with purpose, toward the two figures who had unknowingly reopened a part of her heart she thought would remain closed forever. The story of what came next would be shaped not by fate nor by wealth, but by a choice Celeste felt compelled to make the moment she saw a father's hope falter and a child's hunger break through restraint. The moment Celeste stepped away from her table, the bakery's staff shifted uneasily. They had already sensed tension at the counter, and now a customer, elegant, refined, and dressed in a tailored coat, was approaching with purpose. The young cashier instinctively straightened, brushing pastry crumbs from her apron, because Celeste looked like the kind of woman who expected excellence. Yet Celeste wasn't thinking about customer service or presentation at all. Her attention was fixed solely on Ivan and Liam, who were inching toward the door with a kind of defeated politeness, hoping to disappear before anyone took further notice of their struggle. Even kept one hand on Liam's back to guide him, moving with the wary restraint of a man who didn't want pity but was too exhausted to endure judgment. The last thing he wanted was to cause discomfort or attract attention. He preferred to shrink into the background, to let the door close behind him and end the moment before it carved deeper into his pride. Liam walked close beside him, his small shoulders taut, sensing that something was wrong yet not knowing how to help. A child's instinct often leaned toward quiet support, following, staying near, looking up for reassurance. Liam did all of that with a gentle courage that made Evan's heart ache more than hunger ever could. But as Celeste approached, the energy in the bakery shifted. Her presence carried a kind of controlled intensity that people noticed subconsciously. Her movements were smooth, confident, purposeful. Though her expression was calm, her eyes held something deeper, an emotion she wasn't sure how to name yet. It lived somewhere between grief and resolve, between memory and urgency. Each step brought back flashes of her daughter's face, of small hands reaching for pastries, of laughter that once filled rooms she hadn't entered in years. Celeste drew near to the counter, and the cashier blinked in confusion as she realized the wealthy woman wasn't there to order for herself, at least not in the usual sense. Instead, Celeste's gaze moved to the display case, assessing every pastry and cake with precision. Her eyes lingered on a large vanilla sponge layered with rich cream and berries, a cake that looked as festive as it did comforting. She then turned to the rows of warm sandwiches, fresh baguettes, cinnamon rolls drizzled with icing, and little savory quiches steaming under the heat lamps. "I'd like you to pack that cake," Celeste said, pointing with a steady hand. "And 2 of the warm meal options, the chicken panini, the tomato basil quiche, add pastries, anything fresh from today, and a few sandwiches that will keep well until tomorrow." Her voice was firm but not harsh, more like someone issuing instructions with certainty, because hesitation would slow down something that shouldn't be slowed. The cashier froze for a second, startled by the sudden rush of orders. "All of that," she stammered, as though worried she misheard. Celeste nodded once. "Yes, everything I mentioned. Please package it with care." The manager stepped closer, still unsure what was unfolding. Would you like this prepared to go for an event?" he asked cautiously. Celeste turned her head slightly, her expression calm but carrying an undertone that discouraged unnecessary questions. "To go, yes." Her gaze flicked toward Evan and Liam at the door. The cashier followed the direction of her eyes, and her face softened with understanding. Evan noticed the commotion behind them and paused, puzzled. He didn't want to leave abruptly if someone needed space at the counter, so he stepped aside, guiding Liam gently. He assumed the woman was just a wealthy customer making a large order for a gathering or business meeting. Celeste looked like the type of person who would host elegant receptions. Evan didn't imagine for a moment that her actions had anything to do with them. Liam, however, noticed when Celeste glanced at him, his small brow furrowed not in fear but in curiosity. He rarely encountered people who looked at him with genuine warmth, especially in places where they seemed unwelcome. He tugged slightly on Ivan's coat, as if trying to draw his father's attention, but Ivan was still preoccupied with guiding them toward the exit. While the food was being packed, Celeste approached them, and Ivan instantly felt his throat tighten. He straightened, protective instincts flaring, unsure of what to expect. Wealthy people sometimes stared at him with suspicion, sometimes with discomfort, sometimes with a kind of distant sympathy he found harder to bear than disdain. He didn't want to be scolded for asking for leftovers. He didn't want his son to hear harsh words. And he didn't want a stranger's curiosity about their hardships. But Celeste's demeanor held no condescension. She did not look them over in the way people usually did. She didn't study their clothes or judge their appearance. Instead, her gaze held something resembling sadness layered with understanding so deep that Evan felt disarmed by it. "You asked for leftover pastries," Celeste said, addressing Evan in a calm, steady tone. "Did they have any for you?" Evan swallowed. He didn't know how to respond without exposing himself. He forced a small, polite smile. "It's all right," he said, shaking his head. "We'll manage. Thank you." His instinct was to step away, to shield Liam from any further awkwardness. But Celeste wasn't finished, and her next words stopped him mid-step. "No," she said gently, "you shouldn't have to manage like that." Evan blinked in confusion. "Ma'am." Before he could ask more, the cashier approached holding several large bags, carefully packed and tied. The aroma that drifted from them carried more warmth than Evan had felt in days. "This is what you ordered," she said to Celeste, though her gaze kept flicking toward Evan and Liam. Celeste nodded, then placed a hand on the counter, signaling for the cashier to hand the bags to Evan instead. The cashier hesitated only for a heartbeat, Then, moved by Celeste's expression and perhaps her authority, she extended the bags toward Even. Even stared at them, stunned. For a moment he didn't reach out. He didn't even breathe. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he whispered. "There hasn't," Celeste replied, her tone soft but unwavering. "These are for you and your son." Ivan's breath hitched. His hand trembled as he reached for the first bag, overwhelmed by the weight, not just the physical weight of food, but the emotional weight of kindness he hadn't expected. Liam stared at the second bag, then up at Celeste, as though trying to understand why someone would do this for them. Celeste met the boy's gaze with a faint, heartfelt smile. Something inside her shifted further, something she thought she had lost forever. Even finally managed to speak, though his voice cracked. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Celeste said. "Just take care of your son." Her words were simple, but they struck Ivan with the force of a revelation. She wasn't offering charity for show. She wasn't seeking gratitude. She was offering dignity wrapped in compassion. And in that moment, Ivan realized that sometimes kindness came from the most unexpected places, delivered by someone who understood brokenness in ways he couldn't yet fathom. Liam's eyes drifted toward the strawberry-topped cake behind the glass with the kind of longing a child tries to hide. But hunger has a way of revealing every small wish. He didn't reach for it or tug at his father's sleeve. He simply stood near Ivan, hands tucked close to his chest, watching the bright red slices glisten under the display lights like jewels he knew were not meant for him. The bakery was warm and filled with the aromas of sugar and fresh dough, and it made his hunger pulse deeper. Even so, Liam stayed still, unsure whether he was even allowed to stare too long. He had learned over time that wanting things too clearly often made adults uncomfortable. He knew the difference between dreams he was allowed to have and the ones he wasn't supposed to touch. Still, his gaze kept drifting back to that strawberry cake, the color reminding him of summer markets, where sellers used to let him sample a single berry, back when their lives were far less unstable. Even noticed the way Liam's eyes softened when they lingered on the cake, and it pierced him with a mixture of sadness and guilt. Liam rarely asked for anything, which only made his small desires feel heavier on Ivan's heart. A child should be able to point at treats with excitement, should be able to say, "Can we get that one?" without thinking about money or consequences. But Liam had grown careful, cautious, overly mature for his age, absorbing hardship the way sponges absorb water, quietly taking in every worry his father tried to hide. Even fought the instinct to kneel down and tell Liam someday he could have all the cakes he wanted. But he couldn't bring himself to offer false hope. Instead, he placed a gentle hand on Liam's shoulder, guiding him a little closer so the boy wouldn't feel so alone as they navigated a place overflowing with things they couldn't afford. Liam's small fingers curled around the edge of his father's coat as he shifted his vision from the cake to the pastries beside it, puff pastries dotted with berries, cinnamon rolls dusted with icing, tiny custard pies arranged in neat rows. He wasn't thinking about flavors or textures. He was thinking about fullness, warmth, the simple comfort of eating something that didn't feel like the last scraps of survival. A pastry wasn't just food to him, it represented a piece of a life he had almost forgotten. A life with routines and treats and days that didn't stretch endlessly thin. His stomach tightened painfully, and he pressed his lips together to stop himself from asking for anything. He didn't want to make things harder for his father, whose eyes already carried too much weight. Even felt Liam's gaze drifting again and followed it, landing on the strawberry cake. Something fragile inside him twisted. He remembered birthdays when he had saved every spare coin to buy a slice of cake for Liam, bringing it home in a little box that made the boy's whole face light up. Back then, Even still had work, still had stability, still had the strength to give his son moments of sweetness. Now he could barely provide enough food for survival, let alone luxuries. The realization made his voice falter when he attempted to speak, so he said nothing. Instead, he gently squeezed Liam's shoulder, both to comfort himself and to reassure the boy that despite everything they still had each other. Around them, the bakery bustled with customers choosing treats without worry. A woman laughed as she pointed at a lemon tart, a couple discussed flavors of macarons, and a teenager excitedly ordered 2 slices of cake for her friends waiting outside. The contrast between the vibrant life of the bakery and the hollow ache in Ivan's stomach deepened Liam's awareness of their differences. He didn't resent the others. He simply felt distant from them, like he was watching a world he once belonged to but now hovered at the edges of. Ivan had taught him kindness and patience, but even kindness couldn't erase the sting of wanting something so simple yet so unreachable. The strawberry cake continued to draw Liam's attention involuntarily, its whipped cream peaks, its neatly arranged fruit, the moist sponge visible beneath each slice. To him it wasn't just a dessert. It was a symbol of a childhood he was still trying to cling to, a sweetness that felt almost magical compared to the plain, dry meals they had been surviving on. He imagined what it might taste like, how soft the cream would be, how the strawberries would burst with flavor. The thought made his stomach rumble in a painful spasm he tried to hide by pressing a hand against his shirt. Even noticed the movement immediately. It was subtle, but a parent living in hardship develops a heightened sensitivity to every small sign of discomfort in their child. He knelt slightly, not fully crouching, but lowering himself enough to meet Liam's face. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, voice laced with concern he couldn't conceal. Liam nodded quickly, but his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't trying to deceive. He simply didn't want to cause trouble. Even felt the honesty of that nod. It wasn't confidence, but hope that his father wouldn't worry more than he already did. The boy looked toward the cake one last time, then tore his gaze away, determined not to deepen his father's sense of inadequacy. Even followed the motion, and something sharp twisted in his chest. Even though Liam never asked, Even could feel the unspoken yearning clinging to him like an invisible weight. Hunger wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and it left a mark on dignity that Even struggled to shield his son from. He wished desperately he could at least give Liam something small, something to soften the day's hardships. But he knew the money in his pocket wasn't even enough for the cheapest pastry in the case. A flicker of resignation passed across Ivan's expression as he straightened. He guided Liam gently away from the display case before the longing in those young eyes grew harder to handle. Liam took a small step back, understanding the motion, even if it hurt. His feet dragged slightly against the tiles, and his posture drooped not dramatically, but with the subtle heaviness of a child trying to carry disappointment with grace. What Liam didn't realize was that someone else was watching him closely. From the corner of the shop, Celeste Ainsworth had observed the entire scene, the lingering gaze, the forced restraint, the tremor in Liam's hand as he clutched his father's coat. She had seen children admire pastries before, but the look in Liam's eyes wasn't desire for sweets. It was hunger wrapped in hope, the fragile kind that flickers even in hardship. And Celeste felt a familiar ache rise in her chest, one that made her swallow hard and straighten in her seat. She recognized that look, not because she had ever been poor, but because she had once watched her daughter look at the world with that same blend of longing and openness. A yearning so gentle it broke your heart without meaning to. It stirred memories Celeste had tried for years to bury, memories of afternoons spent choosing cakes for celebrations, of a child's laughter echoing against bakery tiles, of small fingers sticky with frosting. The ghost of her daughter lived in that memory, and seeing Liam's expression brought her back to a place she had avoided entering for far too long. Celeste's gaze lingered on Liam, then shifted to Even. The way the father tried to shield his child from embarrassment, the way he stood between Liam and the world, the way he carried his exhaustion with a kind of quiet strength that struck Celeste with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't remain at her table. Something inside her demanded action, not out of charity or duty, but out of a deep and personal recognition that some wounds only kindness could reach. She rose from her seat with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. Her focus set on the boy whose longing gaze had awakened the part of her heart she thought she had lost forever. Celeste Ainsworth had not intended to linger in the bakery that afternoon. Her schedule rarely allowed pauses, and on most days she moved through the world with mechanical precision: meetings, decisions, contracts, signatures. Yet something about this bakery had pulled her inside. Perhaps the smell of warm bread drifting through the open doorway, or the faint nostalgia that came with seeing a display of pastries decorated with strawberries, a fruit her late daughter used to adore. She had chosen a corner table, far from the noise of passing customers, hoping for a moment of mental stillness. But then she heard Evan's trembling voice asking about leftover food, and the world she had tried to keep neatly controlled shifted subtly around her. At first she tried to stay focused on her paperwork, drawing her attention back to the figures and diagrams before her. But her eyes kept drifting upward, first to Ivan's worn jacket, then to Liam's thin frame, then to the humble way the boy stood with one hand clinging to his father's coat. Celeste had spent years distancing herself from scenes like this, believing that avoiding emotional triggers would protect her from the grief lodged permanently in her chest. Yet grief never left, it simply waited, resurfacing at the smallest reminders, and Liam reminded her painfully, vividly of the child she no longer had. She watched the boy study the pastries with a restrained longing that pierced her deeper than she cared to admit. His expression held no entitlement, no expectation, only cautious admiration, as though he feared wanting too much. That restraint cut through her more sharply than visible hunger would have. Her daughter, Emilia, had once pressed her nose to bakery windows with unrestrained excitement, pointing at treats with all the exuberance of a child who believed the world was full of sweetness meant just for her. Seeing Liam do the opposite, seeing him hold his desires in as if protecting himself, made Celeste draw in a slow, steady breath to steady the swell of emotion rising inside her. She tried to look away, telling herself she didn't know these people or their story. But her gaze kept returning to them, pulled by something instinctual and deeply human. She watched even attempt to stand tall despite the exhaustion clinging to him like an unwelcome second skin. She noticed his shoes worn at the edges, his coat sleeves frayed from uses. The way he cupped the back of his son's head with a gentleness that contradicted every hardship he must have endured. Celeste had seen men break under far less pressure. Yet this man held himself together for the sake of the boy beside him. And that resilience did something to her, something she hadn't felt in years. Memories she had buried beneath layers of work and routine began to surface. She saw flashes of Amelia tugging on her husband's hand, asking for a raspberry tart. She remembered her husband's laughter, warm and steady, as he lifted their daughter into his arms. She remembered birthday cakes, messy icing, family breakfasts. And then she remembered the day all of it was taken from her in an accident so sudden, so merciless, it had shattered her identity. In the aftermath, she had built walls so thick that even her closest friends struggled to reach her. But the sight of Liam and even two people she had never met was cracking through those walls with surprising force. Her gaze sharpened as she observed the interaction at the counter. She saw the cashier hesitate, torn between empathy and the bakery's rules. She saw Even swallow his pride and prepare to leave without complaint. She saw Liam deflate, not dramatically but with a softness that revealed disappointment he tried to hide. This was the moment that finally pulled Celeste out of her chair. She wasn't driven by charity or impulse. What moved her was recognition, the sense that she was witnessing a father who loved his child fiercely but lacked the means to provide for him. And that resonated with the deepest wound in her heart. Celeste's steps were slow at first, controlled as she approached the counter. She didn't yet know what she would do, only that she had to do something. Her mind filled with thoughts she couldn't push away. What if someone had helped her husband the day of the accident? What if kindness from a stranger could have shifted a chain of events? What if she could relieve even a fraction of the suffering she saw before her? She wasn't naive enough to believe acts of compassion could erase tragedy, but maybe they could soften its edges. She studied Ivan's posture as he guided Liam toward the door. The man radiated the kind of exhaustion that came from too many setbacks and too few opportunities. Yet beneath that exhaustion lay a quiet strength and unwavering determination to protect his son. She admired that. She admired the way he didn't complain, didn't beg, didn't demand sympathy. People with far more privilege often carried themselves with far less grace. And that humility stirred something inside her that had been dormant for too long. Her eyes shifted to Liam again. The boy seemed small compared to the world around him, yet his presence felt powerful because of how deeply he felt everything. She noticed how he glanced at the food bags in the cashier's hands, then at his father, then at the exit. He wasn't thinking about the adult's discomfort or the awkwardness of the moment. He was thinking about not making trouble, not burdening anyone, not embarrassing his father. That kind of self-restraint in a child his age was heartbreaking. Childhood should be messy, loud, exuberant, not held in check by hunger and worry. Celeste felt her heartbeat pick up, not from anxiety but from a sudden, undeniable certainty. She needed to help them, not tomorrow, not after thinking it over, not through a formal donation. Now, in this moment, she felt compelled in a way she hadn't felt compelled by anything in years. It didn't matter that she didn't know their names or their circumstances. It didn't matter that she was a billionaire and they had nothing. It didn't matter that she had spent years avoiding personal connections out of fear of losing more. What mattered was the aching truth that she recognized pain when she saw it, and she refused to walk away from it again. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself as emotions tightened her throat. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to embarrass the father or overwhelm the child. She wanted to offer help in a way that preserved their dignity and maybe, just maybe, offered herself a small piece of healing too. The decision settled inside her like a stone sinking to the bottom of still water, definitive, immovable. She stepped forward, her resolve crystallizing with every breath she took. And as she reached the counter to place her order, she knew this moment could change their day, their week, perhaps even their lives. But what she didn't yet realize was how deeply it would change her own. Celeste watched Ivan and Liam with a deepening intensity, her eyes following every small detail, the way Ivan's hand hovered protectively near his son's shoulder, the way Liam tried to make himself smaller as if to ease his father's burden, the heaviness in both their postures that revealed more than any spoken explanation ever could. She noticed the exhaustion etched into the father's features, but also the determination beneath it, the kind of resilient strength forged only through relentless hardship. Liam's restraint struck her even harder. A child should look at pastries with delight, not with the cautious admiration of someone afraid to hope. That fear of wanting too much, that instinct to hide desire, reminded Celeste so painfully of the days following her daughter's death when she herself had forgotten how to reach for anything. Watching the two of them, she felt something inside her beginning to shift, as though an old wound was being reopened, not to hurt her, but to remind her she was still capable of feeling. Celeste forced her gaze away for a moment, trying to center herself, but her mind kept drawing her back to the father and son. She observed the bakery workers exchanging nervous glances, unsure how to respond to Ivan's request for leftover food. She could see the awkwardness in their stiffened shoulders, the uncertainty in their expressions as they tried to balance compassion with store policies. They weren't bad people, they were simply caught between rules and empathy. But the hesitation stung more deeply for Ivan, whose pride was thinning under the pressure of hunger and the instinct to protect his child. Celeste understood rules. She had built an empire on rules, contracts, boundaries. But she also understood pain, and she recognized the subtle humiliation spreading through Ivan's posture as he tried to keep his dignity intact. Her gaze locked on Liam again, and she felt her heart throb with an emotion she hadn't expected. The boy's face carried the kind of quiet endurance she used to admire in her own daughter during difficult days. Amelia had been resilient, yes, but she had also been alive with expression: joy, disappointment, wonder, frustration. Liam's eyes carried those same emotions, but muted, restrained. Folded tightly into himself as if he believed expressing too much might break something fragile between him and the world. Celeste felt her breath catch as the resemblance grew stronger in her mind. She saw echoes of Amelia everywhere, in the boy's meek posture, in the way he tilted his head slightly when observing something he loved, in the instinct to stand close to a parent for comfort without drawing attention. A memory surged through Celeste without warning, her daughter tugging her hand in a bakery just like this one, asking if she could choose her own pastry. Amelia had stood on her toes to see the cakes better, her eyes shining with excitement. Celeste had lifted her up so she could look more closely, brushing crumbs from the counter as her daughter squealed with delight. The memory hit her with such force that she gripped the edge of her table, her breath drawing in sharply as she fought back the ache rising through her chest. She had spent years avoiding places like this, shops filled with sweetness and childhood joy, because they reminded her of everything she had lost. Yet now she found herself face to face with that sorrow, unable and unwilling to turn away. The universe, she thought, had a strange way of putting broken people in front of one another. She didn't know Ivan or his son, didn't know how long they had been struggling, didn't know what had brought them to this fragile moment. But she understood desperation, she understood love twisted with fear, she understood wanting to give your child the world and having life rip that ability away from you. And she understood the loneliness that followed, the kind that curled around your heart and convinced you that kindness was something that happened to other families, not yours. Celeste shifted her attention to Ivan again, watching the way he inhaled slowly as though trying to steady himself in front of Liam. He kept his voice low as he tried to reassure the boy, even though his own disappointment radiated through every line of his face. He didn't lash out at the cashier, he didn't show anger, he didn't show resentment. He simply prepared to walk away because that was a man who had learned to accept hardship as part of his routine. Some people became bitter under the weight of their struggles, lashing out at those around them. But Ivan's struggle had shaped him differently. It had made him softer with his son, gentler in his words, despite the storm he lived in every day. Celeste's chest tightened. She recognized that kind of strength, the quiet, steady kind that parents use to shield their children from harsh realities. Her husband had been that way, steady as a rock even on the worst days. When Amelia broke her arm falling off a swing, it was her husband who had carried the girl into the hospital, whispering soothing words while Celeste paced in panic. When Celeste struggled with running her first business venture, it was her husband who encouraged her, who reminded her she was capable of greatness. But when he died, and Amelia with him, Celeste had lost the anchor she never admitted she needed. She had drifted through the years, since then like a ship without a star to follow, guided only by work because work couldn't leave her. Yet here she was drawn to a complete stranger's pain as if fate had woven their paths together. She watched Liam brush a hand over his stomach, trying to disguise the hunger pangs that clenched at him. She saw even notice this and steady the boy with a gentle touch. The tenderness of that gesture was almost too much for her to bear. It reminded her of the nights she used to sit beside Amelia's bed, brushing strands of hair from her daughter's forehead as she drifted to sleep. It reminded her of the love she once carried so easily, before grief taught her how fragile love truly was. The longer Celeste watched Ivan and Liam, the more convinced she became that she was meant to cross their path. Their suffering wasn't something she could ignore, not because she felt obligated, but because compassion surged inside her with a force she hadn't felt in a decade. She was wealthy, powerful, and respected, yet none of those things had healed her heart. But this moment, this small, raw moment, felt like the first step towards something she had forgotten how to feel: connection. She felt her decision forming long before she stood up. She wasn't helping out of pity. Pity was shallow, fleeting, useless. She wasn't helping out of responsibility. No one expected anything from her. She was helping because she recognized herself in the fragments of their lives. She was helping because she couldn't bear to see a father fail to feed his child, not when she had enough resources to feed 100 families. And she was helping because, in some inexplicable way, this father and son were stirring her heart back to life. Celeste straightened her posture, her resolve settling into her bones. She didn't yet know how deeply her choice would change her future. She didn't know that the boy's gaze would remind her of what love felt like, or that the father's humility would teach her something she had forgotten about: strength. All she knew was that she couldn't leave the bakery without doing something, and so she began to walk, her heart pounding with an intensity she hadn't experienced in years. As she moved toward the counter and toward the two people who had unknowingly awakened her compassion, Celeste's memories rose like a storm she wasn't prepared for, sweeping through her with a force that made the bakery blur around the edges. The polished counters, the warm lights, the gentle hum of customers, it all became distant as the ghosts of her past took shape. She saw her husband's broad smile, the way he used to lean against the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee while watching her decorate cupcakes with Amelia. She heard her daughter's laughter, bright and uninhibited, echoing in the small bakery they used to visit on weekend mornings. Amelia would pick pastries by pointing her whole arm at the display, leaning forward as though her excitement alone could reach through the glass. Those days were filled with warmth, ordinary, everyday warmth that Celeste had once taken for granted. But then came the accident, a turning point. A violent rupture in the middle of her life that split her into a woman before and a woman after. Losing both her husband and her little girl on the same day shattered something fundamental inside her. She had money, connections, properties, investments. None of them mattered when she stood in a sterile hospital room hearing the doctor's voice break as he said he was sorry. After that day, Celeste built her life on structure and control because she had nothing else left. She immersed herself in business deals with almost punishing intensity, attended charity galas without truly listening to anyone, and filled her schedule until she barely had space to think. Grief was like sand; it slipped through the cracks no matter how tightly she tried to contain it. Even when her empire grew, even when magazines praised her resilience and strangers admired her strength, Celeste felt hollow. She lived, but she did not feel alive. Yet here, in a simple bakery, watching Ivan and Liam, something began to crack open. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't painful. It was subtle at first, like a thawing that happens so gradually you don't notice until warmth reaches your bones again. She studied Ivan's trembling hand as he pretended nothing was wrong. She saw the tired slump of his shoulders and the determined way he straightened them again for Liam's sake. That kind of bravery was familiar, not the grand kind displayed in heroic stories, but the everyday kind practiced by parents who carry burdens so their children don't have to. Her husband had possessed that same bravery, and seeing it reflected in a stranger made her heart pulse with a deep, aching longing she hadn't felt in years. She turned her attention to Liam again, and the force of the boy's presence tugged at her emotions like an unseen hand. He reminded her of Amelia in ways that were almost too precise to be coincidences: the same gentle curiosity, the same cautious restraint when wanting something, the same way of watching the world with eyes that saw more than they spoke. She saw hunger in Liam, real physical hunger, but she also saw a different kind of hunger, one that came from living a life where he had to act older than his age. And that recognition struck Celeste with startling clarity. Childhood should be full of exploration and mistakes and small joys, not the heavy maturity that loneliness and poverty forced on a child. It was in that realization that something inside Celeste shifted from observation to conviction. Her gaze flicked between father and son, and she couldn't help imagining what their lives must have been like. A single father, doing everything he could to shield his son from the worst of their circumstances. A little boy who still managed to look at the world with softness despite how unkind it had been. Celeste felt her heartbeat thrum with urgency. These two weren't just struggling, they were hurting, yet still holding on to hope. and she found herself wanting to help them more than she had wanted anything in a long, long time. But helping wasn't the only feeling rising inside her. There was also fear of stepping towards something personal after so many years of avoiding emotional risks. Grief had taught her that love could be ripped away without warning, and she had spent years avoiding deep connections as a way to protect herself. But as she watched Even guide Liam away from the counter with such gentle heartbreak in his movements, Celeste understood something she hadn't allowed herself to admit. Avoiding pain had also meant avoiding life. She pressed a hand against her chest, almost startled by the intensity of her reaction. Compassion flooded her with a heat she wasn't expecting. It didn't feel like pity, it didn't feel like charity. It felt like recognition, like the universe had placed two broken pieces in front of her and whispered that healing sometimes begins with the smallest, most ordinary gestures. She wanted to give Liam food, yes, but she also wanted to give Even the reassurance that the world hadn't forgotten men like him, men who tried, who fought, who refused to give up despite exhaustion, carving lines into their faces. And beneath all that was an even deeper yearning, buried for years, the desire to feel connected to someone again, even if only for a moment. Celeste took a step forward, then another, each movement steady but driven by emotion she could no longer ignore. The fear didn't vanish, but something stronger pushed her onward, a sense that this moment mattered more than her hesitation. She watched Even pause near the door, subtly leaning closer to his son to offer comfort without words. Liam glanced up at him, trust shining through his tired eyes. That simple exchange between father and son pierced Celeste's heart in a way that made her inhale sharply. As if she had forgotten how to breathe with emotion rather than habit, she knew what she needed to do. She needed to intervene, not as a benefactor or a billionaire, but as a human being who saw their struggle and could not walk away. She wasn't doing this to fill the void of her grief, though it might ease it. She wasn't doing it to feel heroic. Even didn't need a hero. He needed a moment of relief, a moment of compassion, a reminder that the universe sometimes placed the right people in the right place at the right time. And Liam needed someone to show him that his small dreams were worth noticing. In that realization, Celeste felt her heart unfreeze in a way she hadn't expected. She gathered her resolve, knowing that once she stepped forward, she would be stepping out of the emotional cocoon she had built around herself. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what that meant. She was ready, and with her decision crystallizing, she moved toward the counter, toward the father and son whose presence had reminded her that compassion wasn't a weakness, but a bridge she was finally willing to cross again. Celeste approached the counter with a sense of purpose that surprised even her. It wasn't the brisk, calculated confidence she used in boardrooms, where every move was strategic. This was different, warmer, driven by something deep inside her chest, something she thought she had lost when her family died. She stood in front of the glass display and assessed the pastries the way a mother might look at gifts for her child, thoughtfully, personally, with an intention to bring comfort rather than impress anyone around her. The employees straightened instinctively, sensing her presence carried weight, though they had no idea who she was. She focused on the cakes first. The large vanilla sponge, perfectly layered with cream and fresh berries, caught her attention immediately. Its surface gleamed under the bakery lights, the berries arranged so beautifully that it looked like a celebration wrapped in frosting. Celeste imagined Liam's expression if he were to taste something so decadent after days of hunger, and the thought tightened her throat with an H that felt both painful and healing at once. She pointed at the cake, her voice steady as she instructed the cashier to wrap it with care. There was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, just firm, grounded conviction. But she didn't stop there. Her gaze traveled to the warm meals resting beneath the heat lamps, chicken pananis with golden grill marks, quiches filled with tomato, basil, and melted cheese, fresh baguettes still steaming from the oven. She selected them one by one, building an order that grew larger with each passing second. The cashier blinked as the list stretched far beyond what most customers ordered. Celeste continued, speaking with measured clarity: 2 paninis, 2 quiches, a box of pastries, an assortment of sandwiches, cinnamon rolls, a loaf of soft brioche, and several fruit tarts. She didn't rush, nor did she waver, because each item she added felt like stitching together a blanket made of nourishment and kindness, something she wished someone had done for her during her darkest days. The workers scrambled to gather everything, packaging food with a mix of confusion and curiosity. They had never seen a woman order so much on a regular afternoon. As the food accumulated on the counter, Celeste's resolve deepened. She wasn't concerned about the total, though she could already guess the order would be expensive. Money meant nothing compared to the look she had seen on Liam's face moments earlier, the mixture of longing, fatigue, and self-restraint no child should ever have to carry. She wanted to erase that expression and replace it with something brighter. She wanted to give even a moment where he didn't feel like he was failing his son. She wanted to do for them what she couldn't do for her own family anymore. With every added item, she felt her chest expand with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to experience since the accident, a sense of purpose rooted not in business success, but in human connection. The employees worked quickly, stacking neatly wrapped packages into large paper bags. The scent of warm bread and sugar grew richer around the counter. Celeste noticed the cashier glancing between her and the father and son waiting near the door, realization slowly dawning. Celeste gave a small nod, a signal that confirmed the purpose of her order without needing further explanation. The cashier's eyes softened with understanding, as though Celeste had given her permission to care as well. Even wasn't aware that the large order being assembled behind him had anything to do with him. He assumed the woman was preparing for an office party or a family gathering. The idea that a stranger would buy such an abundance of food with him in mind didn't cross his thoughts. Life had trained him not to expect generosity. His energy was focused entirely on Liam, trying to guide the boy toward the exit with as much dignity as possible. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the shift in the bakery workers' expressions. Maybe it was the way Celeste stood with a stillness that carried intention. Or maybe it was intuition, the kind that grows sharper after surviving enough hardship. Celeste stepped forward as the cashier finished tying the handles of the last bag. She reached out and placed her hand gently on the counter, as if anchoring herself before the moment she knew mattered. The cashier hesitated only briefly before picking up the first of the large bags and turning toward Even. Celeste didn't speak yet. She wanted her gesture to unfold naturally, without forcing it or turning it into a spectacle. The cashier walked toward Even with wide, cautious eyes, holding out the bag with both hands, unsure how he would react. Even frowned, shifting slightly. "I think there's a mistake," he said, his voice low with confusion. "We didn't order anything." But Celeste stepped closer, her presence offering reassurance rather than pressure. When Even turned toward her, questions tightened his features. He wasn't accustomed to people inserting themselves into his life, especially not elegant women who looked like they belonged in penthouses, not as bakeries. "No mistake," Celeste said, her tone warm, controlled, steady. She nodded toward the bags. "These are for you and your son." Ivan's breath lodged in his throat. His hand hovered in the air, trembling slightly as if afraid to touch something too precious. He shook his head, overwhelmed. "I can't accept that," he managed. The words sounded instinctive, born of pride and shock, not rejection. He stared at the bags as though they were made of gold instead of bread. But Celeste held his gaze with a gentleness that disarmed him completely. "You can," she replied, "and you should." Her voice carried no pity, only sincerity. She didn't speak down to him, didn't try to take control of the moment. Instead, she offered him a bridge, one he could choose to cross without losing dignity. Liam, sensing the importance of the moment, peeked up from behind his father. His eyes widened as he spotted the cake box peeking from one of the bags. For the first time that day, something small but unmistakable ignited across his face, a spark of hope. Even saw it too, saw the light that hadn't been there minutes ago, and something inside him broke open. His resistance softened. He accepted the first bag, his fingers curling around the handles with reverence. The weight of the food made his arm dip, but it was nothing compared to the weight that lifted from his shoulders. Another bag followed, then another, each one like a blessing he didn't know how to process. Liam stepped forward eagerly, helping hold one of the lighter bags, his tiny hands gripping it carefully as if afraid it might vanish if he wasn't careful. Celeste watched them with a warmth that filled the hollow spaces inside her. The bakery felt different now, brighter, not because of the lights, but because something meaningful was happening in front of everyone. Even bowed his head, struggling to find words. Celeste didn't need them. She had already given what she came to give. And in that moment, surrounded by pastries and warm bread and the lingering scent of frosting, 3 lives shifted in a way none of them fully understood yet. Even stood frozen, unable to make sense of what was happening. The bags in his hands felt heavier than anything he had carried in months. Not because of the weight of the food, but because of the emotion behind it. He wasn't used to gestures like this, wasn't used to being seen, to being noticed, to being helped without strings attached. For months he had lived in survival mode, keeping his head down, focusing only on getting through the day without breaking in front of his son. Kindness was something he had taught Liam through stories, not through real-life examples. And yet here it was, standing in front of him in the shape of a stranger whose presence radiated a warmth he didn't understand. He kept expecting her to explain herself, to reveal some ulterior motive, but Celeste simply watched him with an expression that felt too gentle, too real. For a moment, he was afraid to speak, not because he lacked words, but because he feared his voice might crack under the weight of gratitude and disbelief pressing against his ribs. Celeste held herself with calm composure, though inside she felt a whirl of emotions she hadn't experienced in years. She hadn't planned any of this. She had simply reacted first with instinct, then with memory, then with something deeper that she couldn't name yet. Seeing Even so overwhelmed felt strangely familiar, reminding her of her own vulnerability after the accident. Back then, people had tried to comfort her, to offer condolences or gifts or supportive words, but none of them had reached her heart. They had spoken from obligation, not from recognition. But right now, standing in front of Even, she felt connected in a way she hadn't expected. Two lives from different worlds, two paths marked by different pains, meeting in a bakery over something as simple as food. She sensed that Even wasn't used to generosity, and the way he struggled to accept it tugged at her chest. She didn't want him to feel indebted or ashamed. She only wanted him to feel relief, if only for a moment. Liam, oblivious to the complexities swirling between the adults, stepped closer to one of the bags with wide eyes. His little fingers brushed the cardboard of the cake box as if confirming it was real. He couldn't remember the last time he had held something that promised sweetness instead of survival. The frosting, the berries, the soft sponge, he imagined the taste, imagined sharing it with his father, imagined a moment where hunger didn't define their day. His heart thumped with excitement he didn't dare voice. Instead, he looked at Even with a tiny smile, the kind that made his cheeks round slightly. Even saw it and felt something inside him collapse and rebuild at the same time. That smile, the first real one in days, was worth more than pride. It was worth letting someone help, even if it hurt his ego to do so. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you," Even finally said, his voice rough with emotion he fought to keep steady. "No one has ever," he stopped, unable to finish the sentence, because the truth of it weighed too heavily. No one had ever done something like this for him. Not since his wife passed. Not since the world turned into a daily uphill climb. Celeste shook her head gently, but with firm intention. "You don't need to thank me." Her tone was warm, but not patronizing. She met Even's eyes directly. "I saw a father doing his best, and a boy who deserves more than what the world has given him lately." She shifted her gaze to Liam, and her expression softened further. "Let him have today. Let him have something sweeter than struggle." Ivan's throat tightened painfully. He wanted to speak, to respond, to express the gratitude burning in his chest, but the words tangled inside him. He had spent so long enduring hardship that receiving kindness felt foreign. He wished his wife were here, wished she could see this moment, could see someone caring for their son. She had always believed the world still held good people. Even had lost faith in that belief long ago, but now, looking at Celeste, he felt a small part of that faith returning. The employees behind the counter exchanged glances, some touched, some humbled. They had been hesitant when Even first asked about leftovers, unsure whether to bend the rules. But now, seeing Celeste step in with such grace, they felt a shift in the atmosphere. Kindness made the room warmer, it softened their hesitation. They felt a sting of guilt for not acting sooner, but also a strange pride to have witnessed something meaningful. Liam tugged at Even's coat. "Dad," he whispered, eyes locked on the feast they'd been given, can we eat a little now?" He asked it with caution, as if fearful Even might say no, even though the answer had already changed the moment Celeste bought the food. Even nodded, placing a hand on the boy's hair. "Yes, we will." The words tasted like hope. Celeste watched the exchange with a fullness in her chest she hadn't felt in a decade. Seeing Liam's anticipation reminded her of Amelia's energy whenever they bought pastries together. The resemblance wasn't in appearance but in spirit, gentle, earnest, pure. Watching Liam was like watching a distant echo of her daughter, and that echo soothed a part of her heart she thought could never be touched again. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble, but her breath deepened, as though her body was trying to adjust to an emotion it had forgotten. Even turned toward her again, still overwhelmed. "Why?" He asked quietly, not accusing, not doubting, but genuinely wondering why a woman like her would care about a man like him. It wasn't self-pity, just confusion built from years of being overlooked. Celeste answered honestly, "Because you deserve a moment of care, because your son deserves joy, because sometimes people end up in front of us for a reason." She didn't add the rest, the part about her daughter, the memories, the H. That was a story for another time, if ever. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the moment unfolding between them. The bakery seemed to hold its breath as they stood there, three lives brushing against each other in a way none of them expected. Even finally nodded, accepting the kindness not as charity, but as a gift. Liam clutched his small bag proudly as though guarding treasure. And Celeste felt something settle gently inside her, like a piece of her grief had loosened, making room for something new. She stepped back, giving them space, but her eyes lingered on them for another heartbeat. Something told her this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. As Ivan reached for the bags, his hands trembled so noticeably that he had to steady them against the counter before lifting the first one. It wasn't just the weight of the food, it was the shock of the moment, the unfamiliarity of generosity landing so unexpectedly in his life. He had grown used to collecting what little he could, stretching every dollar to feed Liam, accepting hardship like a constant companion. This abundance, this sudden offering of relief felt unreal. He feared that if he blinked too hard, the bags would vanish or the woman would retract her offer, claiming it had been meant for someone else. Yet Celeste didn't waver. She stood tall, composed, and resolute, her gaze steady on him with a warmth he hadn't encountered in too long. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with respect, as if she acknowledged the battles he fought quietly day after day. When Ivan finally wrapped his fingers around the handles, the cashier handed over another bag, then another, and the weight in his arms grew until he had received enough food to last them several days. He felt overwhelmed, almost unworthy. His instinct was to refuse, to insist she take some of it back, that this was too much. But then he saw Liam looking at him with eyes full of hope and wonder, and the resistance he had always clung to began to crack. His son rarely saw abundance, his son rarely saw kindness offered so freely. How could Ivan deny him this moment, this rare, heart-lifting moment, just to protect his pride? Liam's reaction was nothing short of transformative. The boy stepped forward with awe, his small hands hovering near the bags as though afraid the food might disappear if he touched it too quickly. His cheeks flushed with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. He had grown accustomed to saying no to himself before even asking for anything. His father had raised him to be understanding, patient, and grateful for every crumb. But now he looked at the feast being handed to them with genuine wonder, as though the world had cracked open to show him something beautiful. The cake box, with its bright illustrations and the faint shimmer of berries visible through the plastic window, caught his attention most. His eyes widened, reflecting the glossy red fruits like tiny mirrors. The expression on his face tugged at Ivan's heart so fiercely that he had to swallow hard to keep his composure. Celeste noticed Liam's reaction, and her expression softened in a way that revealed a glimpse of the woman she had been before tragedy reshaped her. Seeing the boy's excitement reminded her of Amelia's small, delighted squeals in bakeries long ago, how her daughter would cling to her arm and bounce lightly on her feet when choosing treats. The memory didn't strike her with the same raw pain it usually did. Instead, it warmed her from the inside, as if Liam's joy had found a way to reach the parts of her heart she had feared were permanently closed. She realized that helping Ivan and Liam wasn't reopening wounds, it was helping them heal in ways she hadn't allowed for years. The cashier continued placing bags into Ivan's arms until the counter was empty. The workers seemed to understand the significance of the moment now. Their earlier hesitation had shifted into something like admiration for Celeste and empathy for the father and son. One of the bakers, an older man with flour dusted on his apron, stepped forward with a wrapped loaf of bread he had just taken from the oven. He hesitated, then offered it quietly to Ivan. "For the road," he murmured. Ivan blinked, stunned all over again, and accepted it with a shaky nod. The baker gave him a small, encouraging smile before stepping back. The staff didn't know Celeste's history, her wealth, or her grief. They only knew that she had sparked something good in the room, something they were now compelled to take part in. Celeste watched as Ivan struggled to carry everything, so she reached forward and lifted one of the heavier bags herself before he could protest. The gesture startled him. No, I can carry it," he said quickly. His tone almost panicked at the idea of a woman, especially one so refined, doing manual labor for him. But Celeste shook her head. "Let me help," she insisted calmly, just until the door. Her voice held a firmness that made refusal almost impossible. Ivan's protest faded on his lips. He nodded slowly, humbled not only by her generosity, but by the simple dignity with which she treated him. As they moved toward the door together, Liam clutched his small bag with both hands, holding it close to his chest like a treasure he couldn't bear to drop. He kept glancing up at Celeste, studying her with quiet fascination. To him, she seemed like someone magical, not because she was beautiful or elegant, but because she had seen them, truly seen them, when no one else did. Children understood sincerity better than adults, and Liam sensed no insincerity in her, only kindness. Ivan hesitated again once they reached the doorway, struck by a sudden wave of emotion. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that captured how deeply her kindness had touched him. But the words tangled inside him like threads caught in a knot. "I don't know why you did this," he managed, his voice unsteady, "but thank you more than I can say." His eyes glistened, and he blinked quickly, trying to keep himself from breaking down in front of his son. Celeste met his gaze evenly, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them like something sacred. "You don't need to understand why," she said. "Just take care of your son. That's more than enough reason." The sincerity in her tone struck him deeply. She wasn't helping out of pity or charity. She was helping because she recognized something in him, something admirable, something worth supporting. For a man who had been overlooked and dismissed for so long, that recognition felt like a breath of air after being submerged underwater. Even nodded, unable to speak further. Liam tugged at his sleeve, as if reminding him they still needed to leave before the emotions became too overwhelming. Celeste stepped back, giving them space, but her eyes lingered on them with a softness that made it clear she cared more deeply than she let on. And as Ivan and Liam stepped out into the sunlight with their arms full of food and their hearts unexpectedly full of hope, Celeste realized that this small act, this choice to intervene, had awakened something she thought she had lost forever. She wasn't just giving them relief. She was rediscovering a part of herself that grief had buried. As Ivan finally wrapped his hands around the bags, the weight of everything, food, kindness, disbelief settled into his chest with such force that he nearly lost his breath. His fingers trembled, not from weakness but from the intensity of a moment he never imagined experiencing. For months he had lived in constant tension, measuring every penny, every leftover, every option that might give Liam just one more day of stability. To suddenly be handed such an abundance felt like stepping into a dream that didn't belong to him. He felt undeserving and yet profoundly grateful all at once. When Celeste stepped back to allow him space to accept the bags, Ivan looked down in shock, his vision blurring as emotion hit him deeper than hunger ever had. The edges of his eyes burned and his throat tightened painfully. He tried to steady his breathing, but the overwhelming sincerity behind this gesture broke down walls he had kept up for far too long. Liam stood beside him, watching his father's reaction with wide, searching eyes. He had never seen Ivan look so stunned, not scared, not worried, but genuinely stunned, as if the world had shifted in a way neither of them expected. The boy leaned closer, brushing his shoulder against his father's arm, offering comfort the way children instinctively do when they feel something powerful happening but don't know how to put it into words. Liam didn't fully grasp the complexity of what this moment meant for his father, but he understood enough to feel moved by it. His father, who tried so hard every day to protect him from hunger, fear, and sorrow, was suddenly being given something that eased his burden. And even at his young age, Liam sensed what that kindness meant. Celeste saw Ivan's eyes glisten, and the sight rooted her in place. She had expected him to be grateful, perhaps surprised, maybe even embarrassed. But she hadn't anticipated such raw emotion he tried desperately to contain for his son's sake. She recognized that effort. She had once held herself together in front of her daughter after receiving devastating news about her husband's accident, forcing herself to stay composed so the little girl wouldn't be frightened. That memory rushed through her now, tightening her chest as she watched Ivan fight the same kind of internal battle. She knew the strength it took to hold back tears, not because you didn't want to feel them, but because you needed to remain steady for someone you loved more than your own life. Ivan lowered his head for a moment, trying to gather himself. He wasn't ashamed of his tears, he simply didn't want Liam to worry. But the emotion was too strong, and when he finally lifted his face again, two thin tears escaped down his cheeks before he could stop them. He wiped them away quickly, feeling exposed, vulnerable, and yet oddly relieved. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like he was fighting an unwinnable battle all by himself. Someone had stepped into his darkness with a light he didn't expect, and the relief of that realization was overwhelming. Celeste's heart ached at the sight, not with pity, but with deep empathy, a kind she hadn't allowed herself to feel for anyone in years. She understood that these tears weren't from weakness. They were from a man who had carried far too much for far too long. She felt something inside her shift again, as if the broken pieces of her own heart were slowly rearranging themselves in response to his pain. She took a small step closer, not intruding but offering a presence that felt supportive rather than invasive. "You were allowed to feel it," she said softly, though her voice stayed steady. "You've been holding everything together for so long." Her words were simple, but they landed with profound weight. Even blinked, startled that she could see through him so easily. But Celeste didn't look away. She met his gaze with a kind of understanding that made him feel exposed yet comforted. It was as though she had read the story of his struggle without him ever speaking a word. Liam looked between them, sensing the tenderness in the air. He tugged lightly at one of the bags, as if grounding himself in the reality that this wasn't a dream. "Dad," he whispered, "it's okay." His voice held a fragile compassion that made Ivan's chest tighten even more. To see his son comforting him, offering reassurance he usually had to give, felt like a reversal of roles he wished Liam never had to experience. But it also reminded him that his boy had a heart far stronger than his small frame suggested. Even finally exhaled a shaky breath and gave Liam a soft, reassuring smile. "I'm all right," he murmured, just grateful. He turned back to Celeste, trying to speak past the lump in his throat. "I don't think I can ever repay this." Celeste's expression softened even further. "You don't need to repay anything," she said. "Sometimes help is meant to be received, not returned." She paused, then added with quiet conviction, "And you deserve help. Your son deserves it even more." Ivan's breath caught again at those words, because no one had said something like that to him in so long that he almost forgot what it felt like. The employees nearby pretended to busy themselves, but their lingering glances revealed how touched they were by the scene. Some of them looked humbled, others inspired. The manager, who had been rigid about the rules earlier, now stood with softened eyes, as if reevaluating the policies he once prioritized over compassion. The atmosphere in the bakery grew thick with emotion, but not uncomfortable, more like a shared recognition that something meaningful had just taken place in front of them. Even adjusted the bags in his arms, trying to steady himself. The enormity of what Celeste had done, combined with the exhaustion he carried from months of hardship, made his body feel unsteady. His knees nearly buckled, not from weakness but from the harsh contrast between the life he was used to and the generosity now placed in his hands. Liam saw the wobble and immediately reached out with both arms to support the bag his father struggled with. The sight of his son trying to help him, even in such a small way, made Ivan's heart constrict with pride and pain all at once. Celeste instinctively reached forward, ready to steady even if needed. She didn't touch him. She understood the importance of boundaries, but the concern in her posture spoke volumes. She saw not just a tired man but a devoted father stretched beyond his limits. And the compassion rising inside her was so strong she felt almost breathless from carrying it. Ivan finally straightened again, regaining control of his body. He looked at Celeste with an expression that carried gratitude, disbelief, and something deeper, something that resembled the beginning of trust. It wasn't complete trust yet. Life had taught him to be cautious. But in this moment he trusted her enough to let her see his vulnerability. That was no small thing. Celeste held his gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that this moment meant more than the bags of food, more than the relief, more than the tears. It was a human connection formed between two wounded hearts, one still struggling and one slowly remembering how to feel. For the first time in a long time, Ivan didn't feel invisible, and for the first time in a long time, Celeste felt alive. Liam's face changed the moment he received the bag from the cashier. At first he held it carefully, almost timidly, as though afraid the weight might be too much or the contents too precious for someone like him to touch. But as the realization settled in that this food was truly theirs, that this moment was real, something incredible washed over his expression. A small spark lit up in his eyes, growing brighter with every second. His lips curved into a tentative smile, the kind that trembled slightly at the corners because it wasn't used to forming after so many difficult days. Then the smile grew wider, fuller, blooming across his entire face with a purity that made the room feel warmer. It wasn't a greedy smile, it wasn't wild excitement. It was relief, soft, honest, and deeply human. A child finally allowed to feel joy without fear of loss overshadowing it. That expression hit Celeste with unexpected force. It didn't just warm her heart, it broke it open. She felt her breath shift, turning uneven for a moment as memories of Amelia surged forward, vivid and uninvited. Her daughter used to smile like that when she tasted her favorite treats, her small hands covered in frosting, her eyes sparkling with delight that made everything else in the world seem insignificant. That sweetness, that innocence, had been the pulse of Celeste's life, and losing it had hollowed her out for years. Seeing the same gentle joy on Liam's face brought back emotions she had buried so deeply she sometimes forgot they existed. But instead of pain, something different rose inside her now, something lighter, something almost hopeful. That small boy's happiness stirred pieces of her spirit she thought had died with her daughter. Ivan saw the transformation in Liam too, and his heart ached in a way that was both painful and beautiful. For months, hunger had dulled his son's natural brightness. Financial strain had pressed shadows into the boy's young features. But now, seeing Liam's eyes widen with genuine excitement, seeing that spark he thought he had lost brought tears to Ivan's eyes all over again. He had spent so long feeling like he was failing Liam, fighting against circumstances that felt impossible to overcome. But in this moment, watching his son smile, he felt something else, as the faint, unfamiliar sensation of giving his child a moment of happiness without struggling to pay for it. He felt as though a door had opened inside him, letting in a sliver of light after months of gray. Liam took a small step toward the large cake box, unable to resist peeking through the transparent window again. The bright strawberries glistened under the bakery lights, each slice arranged so beautifully it looked like a treat meant for celebrations, not survival. His fingers brushed the cardboard with reverence, and his imagination filled in how the cake might taste, how soft the cream would be, how sweet the berries, how the layers would melt on his tongue. His father had always tried his best, but Liam couldn't remember the last time he had tasted something this special. The anticipation made his stomach flutter with excitement, and for the first time in so long, the ache of hunger was overshadowed by hope. Celeste watched him closely, absorbing every tiny reaction, the way he clutched the bag tightly with both arms, the way his eyes softened with disbelief before brightening again with anticipation, the way he kept glancing between the cake and his father, checking if he truly had permission to feel this joy. She felt something blooming in her chest, an emotion she had been deprived of for years. Not pity, not sympathy, something far deeper, a connection, a sense of meaning, a reminder that she wasn't as numb as she feared. She found herself imagining what Amelia would have done if she had met Liam, how she would have shared her favorite pastries, how she would have chatted with him about flavors, how they would have bonded effortlessly in the universal language of childhood joy. The thought melted something inside Celeste, replacing years of grief with a pang of bittersweet tenderness. Even lowered himself slightly to meet Liam's eye level, brushing his son's hair gently with his thumb. "You like it?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Liam nodded so vigorously his hair bounced. It made even laugh softly, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in weeks. That laugh carried exhaustion, relief, and love, blending into a single moment that made his chest swell. He didn't care who saw. He didn't care if the world judged him. His son was smiling again, and nothing mattered more than that. Celeste felt the shift too. She sensed the fragile joy growing between father and son, and witnessing it made her feel like she had been granted a glimpse into something sacred. She wasn't part of their family, yet somehow this moment bound her to them in a way she couldn't explain. She wasn't watching as a distant observer anymore. She was witnessing the healing of something precious, something she didn't realize she longs to see again, and that realization settled deep into her bones. The bakery workers noticed the change as well. A few of them exchanged glances, eyes softening as they watched Liam cradle the bag of food with such innocence. Their earlier hesitation was replaced with empathy, even admiration. The atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. Customers who had been distracted began to pay attention, sensing something special happening in the corner. But no one stepped in or interrupted. Everyone could feel that this moment belonged to the father, the son, and the woman who had changed their day. Liam hugged the bag to his chest, grinning up at Even. "Dad," he said, his little voice full of warmth, "we can eat today." It was such a simple sentence, yet it carried the weight of their entire journey. Even's heart clenched. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then he placed a hand on Liam's cheek, his voice cracking as he said, "Yes, buddy, we can." Celeste's heart swelled at the exchange. She stepped back slightly, giving them space, but her eyes never left the boy. She found herself wishing she could freeze this moment, not for her sake, but for theirs. To give them something to hold on to the next time life felt unbearable. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed to feel needed again, not as a billionaire, not as a philanthropist, but as a human being capable of lifting someone else's burdens. As Liam's joy radiated through the air, it reached Celeste in a way nothing had in years. It didn't heal her grief, but it soothed it. It didn't erase her past, but it reminded her she could still feel hope. And when she saw Even look at her with gratitude he couldn't put into words, she understood something with absolute clarity. Helping them had healed something in her too. Celeste walked toward the door with the intention of leaving as gracefully as she had entered. Her steps steady, but her heartbeat carrying a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, a rhythm of purpose, connection, and something dangerously close to hope. She had planned to simply hand over the food, let the moment stand on its own, and walk away before emotions tangled themselves too tightly around her. But as she approached the exit, she sensed movement behind her. Evan's voice reached her, soft but urgent enough to make her pause mid-step. She turned, and what she saw stopped her in place, not out of shock, but out of a deep, gripping tenderness that wrapped around her heart. Even stood there with the bags gathered in his arms. His posture slanted slightly from the weight, but his expression full of something raw and sincere. His eyes glistened again, but this time not from the surprise of unexpected generosity. These tears were born from gratitude that ran deeper than words. And the moment Celeste saw that trembling mixture of relief and emotion crossing his features, she understood that her presence had touched him far more profoundly than she intended. Even opened his mouth, but the first attempt at speaking failed. He swallowed hard, gathering the strength he needed to express the overwhelming feeling inside him. When he finally managed to form the words, they carried a weight that pierced Celeste's chest. "Thank you," he said, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with a level of sincerity that made the world seem to pause around them. "I mean it, thank you more than I can ever explain." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and he lowered his head slightly, not in shame but in humility. It was the kind of gratitude that came from someone who had been holding struggles alone for far too long, someone who had gotten used to being overlooked or treated as inconvenient. To be seen, to be helped without judgment meant more to him than she could comprehend. Celeste inhaled deeply, the emotion rising in her chest almost startling in its intensity. Ivan's words didn't feel like a casual thank you. They felt like a bridge, an unspoken connection formed between two people who had lived very different lives, but shared the same kind of heartbreak that reshaped a person from the inside. She nodded gently, her eyes softening as she absorbed the gravity of his gratitude. "You don't owe me anything," she replied, her voice steady and warm. "Just make sure your son eats well today. That's all I want." Her tone held reassurance, an invitation for him to let go of any guilt or hesitation. She didn't want him to feel burdened by her act. She simply wanted him to breathe easier, if only for a single afternoon. But then Ivan did something that surprised her more than any of the previous moments. He lifted his head and offered her a small, genuine smile, the first unguarded smile she had seen from him. It wasn't wide nor full of confidence, but it was warm in a way that spoke volumes. It was the smile of a man who had been weighed down by hardship and had suddenly, unexpectedly, been given a reason to hope. And that single expression cracked something further inside Celeste, something she didn't realize still existed. She felt her breath catch, not from pain, but from the unexpected joy of being the reason someone found the strength to smile again. Liam, who had been watching the exchange with quiet wonder, stepped forward and tugged gently at his father's sleeve. Then he looked up at Celeste with eyes filled with gratitude far too mature for a child his age. "Thank you, Liam," he said, his voice steady but soft with sincerity. "This means a lot to us." His small voice carried an honesty that made Celeste's heart constrict. She knelt slightly, just enough to meet him at eye level, showing him the respect and attention he deserved. "You're very welcome," she answered. "Take care of your dad, all right?" Liam nodded enthusiastically, as if she had given him an important mission. In that instant, Celeste felt a warmth she hadn't experienced since her daughter was alive, a nurturing, protective instinct she believed had vanished forever. She rose to her full height again and took a small step back, preparing to leave. But before she could turn, Ivan's voice reached her one last time. "You've helped us more than you know." This time his tone carried something deeper, not just gratitude, but the slow beginnings of trust. The unspoken acknowledgement that her presence had altered the direction of their day in a way he would never forget. Celeste felt that weight settle inside her, and for the first time in years she welcomed it. It was the kind of emotional weight that didn't crush, but grounded, a reminder that she was still capable of touching another person's life in a meaningful way. As she pushed open the door and stepped into the warm daylight, the world felt different, brighter, softer, more forgiving. The sun struck her face, warming the air against her skin, and she realized she had been moving through life like a shadow for far too long. Today, in the simple act of helping a father and his son, she had found something she didn't know she was searching for, a sense of belonging to humanity again. She walked forward with a renewed steadiness, each breath filling her chest with a sensation she hadn't allowed herself to feel in over a decade. She didn't know where the road ahead would lead, didn't know whether their paths would cross again, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: something inside her had shifted, and she could no longer pretend she felt nothing. Behind her, through the bakery's glass window, she saw Ivan and Liam walk toward a nearby bench with their arms full of the food she had given them. The boy's excitement was almost visible in the way he moved, quick and eager, as though the weight of hunger had been lifted from his small shoulders. Ivan followed him with steadier steps than before, looking at his son with softened eyes. Eyes no longer filled purely with worry but with the fragile glow of hope. That sight anchored itself inside Celeste, settling into a place that had long been empty. She continued walking, the distance between her and the bakery growing with each step, yet the connection she felt to the father and son remained as strong as ever. She didn't need to stay to witness what came next. She already knew the moment would live inside her long after the day ended. And as she turned the corner, her heart carried something new, something she thought had died with her past. It carried the beginning of healing. Ivan and Liam carried the bags outside, stepping into the warm afternoon sunlight with a sense of disbelief that clung to them like a thin mist. The world felt different, gentler, softer, though nothing visible had changed. Cars still rolled down the street. People still passed by in hurried steps. But for the first time in a long while, Ivan felt as though the constant weight on his shoulders had eased, even if only for a moment. They reached a small bench near the bakery, its wooden slats warmed by the sun, and Ivan lowered the bags onto it with careful reverence. Liam climbed onto the bench beside him, his legs dangling freely, his hands already reaching toward the cake box with eagerness he could finally allow himself to express. Ivan watched him with warmth swelling in his chest, knowing that he hadn't seen his son look this hopeful in months. The boy's fingers trembled with anticipation as he opened the cardboard lid, revealing the vibrant strawberries arranged beautifully on top. Liam let out a tiny gasp, the kind children make when they see something wondrous, and even felt tears prick behind his eyes once more. He cut a small piece for Liam, larger than he would normally allow himself to give under their circumstances, because today wasn't a day for rationing or fear. Liam took the bite with both hands, holding it carefully as though it were a treasure. The moment the cake touched his tongue, his entire face relaxed into bliss. His eyes fluttered with pure delight, and he closed them for a moment as though he needed to savor the feeling. Ivan chuckled softly at the sight, though his laughter carried a hint of emotion. Watching his son enjoy something so simple yet so precious broke him open in the best possible way. He took a piece for himself too, and as the sweetness spread across his palate, he felt an odd sensation bloom inside him, a reminder of what comfort tasted like. As they ate, passers-by glanced at them, some smiling at the wholesome scene, but Ivan paid them no mind. For once, he wasn't thinking about judgment or survival or tomorrow's uncertainty. He was simply present with his son, with the taste of cake, with the memory of a kindness given freely. Liam swung his legs happily as he ate, occasionally stopping to glance at the other bags filled with sandwiches, pastries, and warm meals. "Dad," he said between bites, "we can eat dinner tonight and tomorrow too." His voice carried a brightness Ivan hadn't heard since their lives had begun to crumble. "Yes, buddy," Ivan murmured, brushing crumbs from Liam's cheek, "we can." His voice cracked on the last word, but he didn't hide it. Meanwhile, Celeste had walked nearly half a block away before something compelled her to stop. It wasn't hesitation she didn't regret leaving, but an instinct to look back just once. She turned slowly, her eyes drawn to the bakery's direction. Through the glass and past the clusters of people walking by, she spotted Ivan and Liam seated on the bench. The sight rooted her in place. Liam's smile was bright enough to reach her from across the street. Ivan sat beside him, shoulders no longer burdened by the crushing weight she had noticed earlier. He looked lighter. Not carefree, life wouldn't allow that so easily, but lighter in a way that suggested he had remembered what hope felt like. The moment tugged at something deep within her, and she felt her breath hitch. She hadn't experienced a scene this genuine, this raw, this filled with quiet emotion, since her daughter had been alive. Watching father and son share their first real moment of peace in months brought a soft H to her chest, a sweet H, one that healed rather than harmed. She wondered what they would do next. Would they head home early? Would they save some food for later? Would this moment shape them in a way she could never fully understand? She didn't know, but she found herself deeply wishing the best for them. In her mind, she imagined her husband standing beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder the way he used to. He would have approved of what she had done, not because of the size of the gesture, but because of its sincerity. He had always been the kind of man who believed one act of compassion could ripple outward far beyond what the giver ever witnessed. Celeste felt the familiar sting of loss, but unlike the grief that usually stabbed her sharply, this feeling was gentler, almost soothing. She felt as though, for the first time in years, her family wasn't entirely gone. A trace of them lived on in the kindness she had extended today. Ivan, unaware that she was watching, tore another piece of cake and offered it to Liam, whose face lit up even more. The boy leaned comfortably against his father's side, eating contently, safe and satisfied. Ivan placed a hand on his son's back, stroking it gently in a way that conveyed volumes. Their bond, strengthened through hardship, seemed to glow in the sunlight. And Celeste realized she wasn't witnessing just relief, she was witnessing healing. Not the dramatic kind, not the overnight miracle, but the gentle spark of it, a father feeling hope again. A child reclaiming a bit of lost innocence, a small family breathing easier after months of tension. Her steps resumed, but slower, more grounded. She didn't need to stay, the moment belonged to them now. She had done what her heart urged her to do, and that was enough. As she walked away, she felt something she hadn't felt in a decade, the sense that life still had places where beauty appeared without warning, that wounds could soften, that compassion could rebuild the pieces of a shattered heart. Ivan and Liam remained on the bench even after the cake was gone, simply enjoying the warm breeze brushing against their faces. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel suffocating. Even glanced at the bags resting beside them and felt a surge of determination. This moment, this kindness had reminded him that he wasn't as alone as he thought. It didn't erase their struggles, but it gave him strength to face the next day. His son leaned into him, full of trust, and even wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. And just as Celeste stepped fully out of sight, even whispered softly to his boy, "There's still good in this world, Liam." The words felt like a vow, one he intended to carry forward from this day on. Liam nodded against his shoulder, his voice muffled but heartfelt. "I believe it now." In that warm afternoon, with the taste of strawberries still lingering in the air and the memory of a stranger's compassion anchoring their hearts, hope found its way back into two lives that desperately needed it. And even though none of them knew it yet, this small moment would become the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond that simple bench outside a bakery, a story of healing, human connection, and the unexpected ways broken hearts find one another. The lesson of this story unfolds not through grand speeches or dramatic events, but through a single, profoundly human moment, one that reveals how deeply lives can change when compassion steps forward at the exact time it is needed most. At its heart, the story teaches that kindness is never small, never insignificant, and never wasted. It reminds us that even in a world where people rush past each other, burdened by their own struggles, there remains a quiet power in simply noticing, truly noticing the pain or exhaustion in someone else's eyes. Ivan had carried his hardship silently for months, convinced that the world had turned indifferent to men like him. Men who fought daily for their children with nothing but determination. What Celeste offered him was not only food but visibility. By choosing to see him, she gave him something far more nourishing than the meals she purchased. She gave him the reassurance that his fight mattered, that his son's life mattered, and that he himself was worthy of care. The lesson here is that compassion can be the difference between a person continuing to endure or giving up. A single act can restore the fragile belief in humanity that so many people lose when life becomes unbearably difficult. Another lesson woven into the story is the profound truth that healing often comes from unexpected connections. Celeste carried a grief so deep it had frozen her from the inside, isolating her from the world and making her believe that love, once broken, could never be felt again. But when she saw Liam's innocence and Evan's courage, something inside her stirred, a reminder of the life she once had, the love she once gave so freely. Through helping them, she rediscovered the part of herself that tragedy had stolen. The story shows that kindness doesn't flow in just one direction. Helping someone else can become a way of healing our own unseen wounds. It teaches us that even the strongest hearts can break, but they can also be mended by showing up for someone who needs us. Sometimes the person we save is ourselves. The relationship between vulnerability and strength is another powerful message. Ivan's willingness to accept help despite his pride, despite his fear of appearing weak, reveals a truth many people overlook. Strength is not found in carrying burdens alone, but in doing whatever it takes to care for the people we love. Accepting help when we desperately need it is not a failure, it is courage. Liam, though young, demonstrates another kind of strength, the quiet resilience of a child who has learned to endure hunger, disappointment, and uncertainty. Yet even this childlike strength holds fragility. When Celeste's kindness brings light back into his eyes, we are reminded that children should not have to be strong all the time. They deserve joy, nourishment, and protection. Through them, the story teaches that compassion toward the most vulnerable among us, particularly children, is not optional. It is a responsibility every society should uphold. The final and perhaps greatest lesson of the story is that kindness is most powerful when it is offered without expectation. Celeste didn't reveal her wealth, didn't ask for gratitude, didn't want recognition. She simply acted because her heart recognized the suffering of another. True compassion does not look for reward, it looks for need. This act reminds us that you never know what someone is carrying inside, what battles they are fighting silently, what losses they've endured, or how close they are to breaking. A small gesture, one moment of generosity, can become the turning point in someone's life. For Ivan and Liam, the cake in those meals were more than food, they were proof that the world still had space for goodness. For Celeste, the act of giving became a doorway back into her own humanity. And for anyone who witnesses their story, the lesson is simple but profound: kindness costs little, yet it has the power to alter the course of another person's day, heart, or even their entire future. In the end, the story teaches that every act of compassion, no matter how small, creates ripples. Ripples that reach far beyond the moment, far beyond the giver, far beyond what we ever expect. Kindness is not just something we do, it is something we become. And when we choose it even once, we step into a world where healing becomes possible for others and for ourselves. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my latest videos. If you have any ideas or topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment below. I always read all your comments.